The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, the silence hanging heavier with each passing second. Every gaze was on Adam, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the podium. His face, pale and drawn, betrayed a man on the edge. I did it," he whispered, barely audible, his voice cracking under the weight of his confession. The judge leaned forward, the gavel poised in midair, but the moment seemed to stretch endlessly. His words had landed like a bomb, shaking the very foundation of the trial. The prosecutor's eyes widened, while the defense attorney froze, disbelief shadowing his face. Adam's confession wasn't just an admission, it was a revelation. His dark secret, buried for years, had now come to light in the most public of ways. The room was frozen in shock, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. Every breath felt like it was drawn from the depths of the earth, as if even the air itself was waiting for what would happen next. His confession hung in the air like a thick fog, an echo that would haunt every person present, forcing them to question the truths they thought they knew. The gavel finally came down, but it wasn't the end. Adam's confession had shattered the delicate balance of the trial. As he was led out of the courtroom, the whispers began. The ripple effect of his words spread like wildfire. Some believed him, others saw it as a last-ditch attempt for sympathy. But for his family the truth was undeniable. His wife, Maria, sat frozen in her seat, staring ahead with empty eyes, her face pale. What had she married? The man she thought she knew, or a stranger hidden behind the veil of lies? Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, and her lips trembled as if holding back a flood of emotions she couldn't yet articulate. Meanwhile, the prosecutor, Diane, stepped forward, her face hardening as she faced the judge. Her mind raced. Adam's confession wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. There were still so many pieces to put together. What had driven him to this point? Was he truly guilty, or was there more to the story than anyone realized? In the shadows, a figure watched, unseen, but the weight of their presence was undeniable. They had been waiting for this moment, and now everything would change. Later that night, Maria stood by the window, staring out into the darkened street. The house felt foreign now, the silence a heavy weight in the air. Her thoughts were jumbled, a chaotic mess of anger, betrayal, and confusion. Adam's confession had unraveled everything she thought she knew about him, about their life together. The warmth of their shared moments now seemed hollow, twisted. She ran her fingers over the wedding band on her finger, as if clinging to the last vestiges of the life they had built. The soft murmur of the wind outside did nothing to calm her racing heart. She had been warned so many times by so many people, but she had always refused to listen. Now she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being swallowed by the darkness of his secret. As the hours passed, her mind drifted back to the first time she met him. So full of charm, so full of promises. But now, she wondered if she had ever really known him at all. From across the street, a shadow moved, barely visible in the dim light. The figure watched the house intently, never blinking, never moving. The faintest hint of a smile played on their lips, but it was a smile full of malice. Of something darker. They had seen it all, the confession, the aftermath, and now they would make their move. This was no coincidence. They had planned this moment, waited for it. Adam had unknowingly played right into their hands, and now they were in control. The truth had been exposed, but that didn't mean the game was over. It had only just begun. In the days that followed, Diane found herself combing through the case files again, the weight of Adam's confession still hanging in the air. But something didn't sit right with her. She had seen confessions before, but this one felt different, too easy, too convenient. As she stared at the photo of the victim, something clicked in her mind, a piece of the puzzle falling into place. She wasn't sure yet, but she knew one thing: she was onto something. Adam's confession wasn't the full truth. There was more to uncover. She had to dig deeper, to uncover the hidden layers of this case, no matter what it took. She could feel the walls closing in, but she refused to back down. Justice would be served, but only if she could get to the heart of the matter. Adam sat alone in the small interrogation room, the cold metal chair digging into his back. He had confessed. He had done what they asked of him, but the weight of that truth was almost unbearable. Every breath felt like a betrayal, each heartbeat an echo of the life he had torn apart. He wasn't sure if the guilt was for the crime he had committed or for the lies he had lived. The walls of the room seemed to close in on him, the flickering overhead light casting shadows that danced around him, taunting him. He wanted to run, to disappear into the darkness, but he couldn't. Maria's face haunted him. Her disbelief, her tears. How could he have done that to her? How could he have lived with the secret for so long? And yet, there was still something inside him that urged him to hold on to the story, to keep the truth buried deeper, where no one could reach it. But as each second passed, Adam knew that the truth had its own momentum, and soon it would break through everything he had built, exposing him completely. Maria had not spoken to Adam since that fateful day. The silence between them was deafening, each passing hour filled with unanswered questions. She kept replaying his confession in her mind, trying to make sense of it, but it only left her more confused. Why had he kept this from her for so long? What had changed? The house felt like a shell now, empty and devoid of warmth. She wandered aimlessly from room to room, touching objects that once held meaning, but now felt foreign. The pain in her chest was constant, a gnawing ache that wouldn't go away. She couldn't escape the memories, the moments they shared that now seemed tainted. But even in her confusion, a part of her still wanted to believe in him, wanted to believe that there was more to the story, that there was something that could explain everything. She wanted to find the person she had married again, to hold on to that love, but she wasn't sure if that person still existed. Diane had been quiet lately, her thoughts preoccupied with the case, but there was something else gnawing at her. A nagging suspicion that the truth wasn't as simple as Adam's confession suggested. She had seen too many cases where the truth was buried beneath layers of lies. But this one felt different. Adam's confession, though damning, was too neat, too easy. Something was being concealed. As she sat at her desk, flipping through the case files, her mind drifted back to her first encounter with the case, how it had all seemed so straightforward, so black and white. But now, with each passing hour, new questions emerged. She had learned to trust her instincts over the years, and right now, her gut told her that Adam wasn't the only one hiding something. But who? Who else was involved? The walls of this case were built on secrets, and Diane was determined to tear them down. Back at the station, Detective Lee sat in the quiet of his office, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights, his only company. He had been in the force long enough to recognize when a case wasn't as clear-cut as it seemed. Adam's confession didn't sit right with him, and neither did Diane's growing obsession with the case. Lee respected Diane, but something about her drive to find more was unsettling. It wasn't like her to question the obvious. But as he sat there, staring at the case files, a thought gnawed at him. Was he just following the lead, or had he become part of something bigger, something more dangerous? He had seen the toll. This case was taking on everyone involved. But it wasn't just the investigation. It was the truth itself. What if the truth was something none of them were prepared to handle? As the investigation continued, it became clear that not everyone was invested in finding the truth. In the midst of it all, a figure watched from the shadows. Victor Moretti, a man whose reputation preceded him, stood at the edge of the investigation like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. He had everything to lose if the truth came out, but he also knew how to manipulate people like pawns on a chessboard. The truth was malleable. It could be shaped, twisted, and rewritten. And that was exactly what he intended to do. If Diane thought she could uncover the truth, she was mistaken. The game wasn't about finding justice. It was about controlling the narrative. And he, as always, held the keys to that story. Days passed, but the air seemed to grow heavier around Adam. Every corner he turned, he was reminded of his past, of the truth he had tried so desperately to bury. The police had been relentless, going through every file, every scrap of paper that might offer a clue. But Adam could feel the walls closing in on him. Diane had begun to dig deeper, her questions sharper, her eyes more piercing. She wouldn't let go. Not of him, and not of the case. In the quiet of his cell, Adam wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. What if his confession wasn't enough? What if they were going to find out the truth behind his lies? His guilt over what he had done to Maria gnawed at him, but there was another truth hidden even deeper, one that, if exposed, would ruin everyone involved. His thoughts were a whirlwind of panic and regret. Adam had no idea how long he could keep this secret buried. Every moment that passed felt like a countdown to something far worse than he could imagine. Diane's investigation had reached a new point, one where the pieces were scattered and confusing. She couldn't ignore the growing feeling that Adam's confession was just the surface of something much darker. She went through the file on the victim again, poring over the details that seemed to always lead back to one thing: the connection between Adam and the victim's family. The name kept appearing in the most unexpected places: old contacts, documents buried under layers of irrelevant information. It was a thread, weak but undeniable, and it had the potential to unravel everything. There was something that had been hidden from the public eye, something that everyone had overlooked. Diane knew she couldn't let this go, but as she dug deeper, she found herself questioning just how far she was willing to go to uncover the truth. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. Maria hadn't spoken to Adam in days, and yet she couldn't escape the pull of the truth. Her mind kept circling back to his confession. She needed to know more. The days of ignoring it were over. Despite her heart telling her to let go, a darker part of her couldn't help but question everything. She had started to do her own digging, asking around, going through old letters, and even tracking down people who might know something. That's when she found the first crack: the letter. Buried beneath a pile of her late mother's things, it was addressed to her in a neat hand. The content was simple but chilling, a warning. It was signed by someone she didn't recognize, someone who had been in Adam's life before her. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was the start of something bigger. What had Adam been involved in? And who was this mysterious figure? The more she uncovered, the more she realized the web she was stepping into was far more complicated and dangerous than she had ever imagined. Detective Lee watched Diana's obsession with the case grow, and with it, his own unease. He had always trusted her instincts, but now something didn't feel right. She had become consumed, fixated on the pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit. Lee respected Diane, he always had, but there was a line that was being crossed. She was going too far. He tried to reason with her, but she brushed him off, too determined to unearth the truth, no matter the cost. He knew that people who pushed too hard for answers often found things they were never meant to know. But what worried Lee the most wasn't Diana's drive. It was the feeling that they were playing into someone's hands. Whoever was orchestrating this was far more dangerous than they realized. And if they weren't careful, they might end up buried under the weight of their own pursuit of justice. Victor Moretti had watched every move closely. His fingers moved like a maestro conducting a symphony, guiding the investigation with subtle whispers in the right ears. He had played his cards carefully, pulling the strings behind the scenes, ensuring that Adam's confession would lead to this very point: chaos. Now, as the investigation deepened, the puzzle pieces began to fall into place. Diane, consumed by her need to uncover the truth, was becoming predictable, just as he had hoped. He could see the strain in her eyes, the desperation in her actions. She was getting too close, and that meant it was time to shift the game. He couldn't let her uncover the full truth. Not yet. Not when he still held the key to everything. Victor's smile widened as he made another call, sending things into motion. The truth was a weapon, and he was its master. Diane sat in her office, staring at the photo of Adam, now the center of the investigation. She had circled it several times in her notes, but it wasn't until today that the final piece clicked. There was a connection she had missed, a person whose name had been overlooked in the mountain of paperwork. It wasn't just the victim's family. It was someone close to Adam. Someone who had been part of his life long before the crime. Diane traced her finger along the edge of the photo, her mind racing. The figure in the photo wasn't just a witness, it was the key. The person had ties to Victor Moretti, a name that had only emerged in the shadows. The weight of this discovery sank in. If what she suspected was true, everything about this case was a lie. Adam's confession was just a diversion. The truth hidden in plain sight had been manipulated from the start. And if she didn't act fast, this could all slip through her fingers. Maria could feel the walls closing in. The more she uncovered, the more questions arose. The letter she had found earlier only deepened the mystery. She had to confront Adam. There were no more excuses, no more silence. She needed answers, and she needed them now. The silence between them was unbearable. As she entered the prison visiting room, Adam sat across from her, his face a mask of guilt and fear. For the first time in a long while, Maria didn't feel anger. She felt pity. She sat down, her eyes never leaving his. Who was she, Adam? Her voice was quiet, but the words held the force of years of unanswered questions. Who was the woman in the letter? Adam's eyes flickered with panic, his hands trembling. He knew this moment had come, but he wasn't prepared for the force of her gaze. He had always hidden the truth, but now there was no place left to run. The confession was just the beginning. Now, the truth would tear everything apart. Victor Moretti had been playing the long game, and now the pieces were aligning perfectly. He had always known this day would come, the day when his role in the story would be exposed. But it didn't matter. He had already set the stage. Diane's investigation was getting too close, but he had anticipated this. He had made sure of it. When he received the call from his associate, he wasn't surprised by the news. It was exactly what he needed. The file on Diane had been opened, her past and weaknesses laid bare before him. The puppet strings he had pulled so delicately now tightened. Victor's expression remained calm, his fingers tapping the desk as he prepared for the next move. There was no going back now. Diane was just another pawn in a much bigger game, and Victor intended to be the one pulling the strings until the very end. As Diane pieced together the final fragments of the case, she found an unexpected ally, Detective Lee. He had remained quiet for weeks, but now, as the truth began to unfold, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. He had always respected Diane, but now he saw the danger she was heading toward. "You're not in this alone," he said, his voice steady but laced with concern. "We have to expose Moretti for who he really is." Diane looked at him, surprised by his sudden shift, but the sincerity in his eyes was undeniable. She had always trusted him, but now, with the weight of the truth on her shoulders, she realized that Lee might be the one person she could rely on. Together, they would have to confront the shadows and expose the true mastermind behind the conspiracy. Adam sat in his cell, the walls closing in tighter with each passing day. His confession had shattered his life, but now, in the silence of the cell, he was faced with the greatest decision he had ever made. Maria's confrontation still echoed in his mind, but there was more at stake now than just his marriage. The truth he had been running from, the deeper, darker secret, could destroy everyone. But could he live with the guilt of keeping it hidden? His mind raced as the days blurred together. He had one last chance to make things right, one last opportunity to protect those he loved. But would they forgive him? And more importantly, could he forgive himself? Diane stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her tie, her reflection staring back at her with an intensity that matched the storm inside her. Today was the day. The truth, long buried and manipulated, would finally come to light. She felt the weight of the decision she was about to make, one that could change the course of the investigation and her own life forever. With Lee by her side, she had gathered everything she needed. The pieces of the puzzle that Victor Moretti had so carefully placed were now within her grasp. The connection between him and the victim's family was undeniable, and the evidence she had uncovered would expose him for what he truly was. A master manipulator who had orchestrated everything from the beginning. As she prepared to step into the courtroom, her mind raced, not with fear, but with determination. She knew this moment would define everything. It wasn't just about justice for the victim anymore. It was about taking down the puppet master and stopping him from ruining more lives. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Adam sat in the defendant's chair, his gaze fixed on the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. His mind was a whirlwind, torn between fear and the faint hope that Diana's investigation had revealed something that could save him. But as the judge called the court to order, Adam knew it was too late. Diane stepped forward, her files in hand. The prosecutor, Victor Moretti's ally, stood up to object. But it was clear, this was the moment of truth. With a quiet but firm voice, Diane began to speak, laying out the evidence piece by piece. The crowd held its breath as the shocking connection between Moretti and the victim's family was exposed. As she revealed the documents, Adam felt a sudden surge of guilt for not confessing sooner, for not doing the right thing when it mattered. But now, there was no turning back. The truth was out, and it would change everything. Victor Moretti sat in the back of the courtroom, his expression unreadable, but inside, he could feel the walls closing in. Diane had come too far, and now the evidence she presented was undeniable. He had underestimated her, underestimated the lengths she would go to expose the truth. But as she continued her impassioned speech, laying bare the full scope of his manipulation, he felt his grip on the situation slip. For the first time, Victor realized that he might not be able to control the outcome. The pieces were slipping from his hands. His carefully crafted web of lies was unraveling in real time. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had been caught. And now, all he could do was watch as his empire crumbled. The room fell into an uneasy silence as Diane called for Adam to take the stand. He stood, his legs unsteady beneath him, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment where everything could either come together or fall apart. Adam stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper as he began his testimony. He spoke of the choices that led him to this point, the lies that had built his life, and the guilt that had followed him every day. But as he reached the moment of truth, the weight of the past seemed to overwhelm him. His words faltered, and his emotions broke through the dam he had spent years building. With tears streaming down his face, he finally confessed everything, the full, unvarnished truth. The room was silent, every eye on him as he laid bare the secrets he had hidden for so long. Maria, sitting in the audience, covered her mouth in shock as the truth unfolded before her. Diane watched, her gaze unwavering, knowing that Adam's testimony would be the final key to bringing down Moretti. As Adam's words echoed in the courtroom, Victor's expression grew darker, his jaw tightening with each passing second. The truth was out, and there was no denying it now. Diane had done it. She had exposed him, not just for his role in Adam's downfall, but for everything he had hidden in the shadows. The judge called for a recess, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. Outside the courtroom, Victor's empire was crumbling. The police were already moving in, gathering evidence, arresting his allies. And for the first time in a long while, Victor felt a chill run through him. He had been caught. There was no escape, no manipulation that could save him now. His carefully crafted world of power and control was unraveling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As the doors to the courtroom closed, Diane stood at the center of it all, knowing that justice had been served, but at a cost. The truth had been revealed, but the consequences were far from over. The days after the trial were a blur. For Diane, the weight of her victory was bittersweet. The courtroom had been her battleground, but now, standing outside, she realized that the fight was far from over. Yes, Victor Moretti had been exposed, his empire crumbling beneath the weight of his lies. But the damage done was irreversible. Adam's testimony, while essential, had left a deep scar, one that no verdict could heal. Maria had left the courthouse that day with no words, no questions, just a look of profound grief. Diane couldn't help but feel the heaviness of the cost. Justice had been served, but it had come at a price. For Adam, redemption seemed out of reach, and for Maria, the woman who had loved him, nothing would ever be the same. And yet, Diane knew that despite the toll, this was the world they lived in, one where truths were buried, and only the bravest were willing to unearth them. As she walked away from the courthouse, her heart weighed with a complicated sense of closure, knowing that no victory in this world was ever as simple as it seemed. Maria sat in the empty house, the silence more oppressive than it had ever been before. Adam's confession had torn apart everything she thought she knew, and yet she couldn't bring herself to walk away. His lies, his betrayal, they were too much to bear. But deep down, she still loved him. She had to face the truth. The man she had married was a stranger, someone she would never truly know again. And that was the hardest part of all. She ran her fingers over the edge of their wedding photo, a piece of their past, now stained by the weight of secrets. Adam had failed her, but she had failed herself too by not seeing the cracks sooner. The anger that had surged within her was now a dull ache, replaced by the realization that she had to let go. There was no going back. The person she had been before Adam's confession was gone, and Maria knew she couldn't stay trapped in the memory of what had once been. It was time for a new beginning, even if it meant walking away from everything she had fought for. In his cell, Adam lay on the cot, his mind racing, but his body numb. The consequences of his actions were now inescapable. The confession had been his last desperate attempt at redemption, but the aftermath had only deepened the chasm between him and those he loved. Maria was gone, and he knew that his actions could never be undone. But there was one thing left, one last flicker of hope. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, Adam understood the true weight of his guilt. It wasn't the consequences that haunted him, it was the lives he had ruined, the people he had betrayed. And as the days passed in the quiet of his cell, he knew that redemption wasn't something that could be granted by anyone else. It was something he would have to earn, step by painful step, if he could ever find it at all. Victor Moretti sat in a holding cell, the realization of his downfall settling in. The life he had spent decades building, one of control, manipulation, and power, had been dismantled in a matter of days. The walls of his cell felt closer than they ever had in his luxurious mansion, and the silence that surrounded him was suffocating. He had always prided himself on being steps ahead of everyone, but Diane had outmaneuvered him. His associates had turned on him, and the evidence that had once been hidden away was now exposed for all to see. But Victor wasn't the type to go down quiet. He had one last card to play, one final move that could turn the tide back in his favor. As he sat in the cold cell, plotting his next steps, the weight of his situation began to sink in. The game wasn't over, not yet. But for now, Victor would bide his time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. Weeks passed, and life began to settle into a new, uncertain normal. Diane continued her work, but the echoes of the case lingered in her mind. There were still unanswered questions, still secrets that hadn't been fully revealed. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, waiting, even after the trial had ended. It was the lingering ghost of the case, the part of her that couldn't let go. It wasn't just about the trial. It was about the people she had grown close to, the lives that had been altered in ways no one could fully comprehend. The truth had come to light, but the scars would remain, and with each passing day, Diane realized that justice was never as clear-cut as it seemed. As she walked through the empty halls of the precinct, she thought of Adam, Maria, and even Victor, wondering if any of them would ever find peace. The truth was powerful, but it was also a haunting presence, one that couldn't be erased so easily. The world seemed to have moved on. Diane stood at the edge of the pier, the cool evening air sweeping past her. The city lights twinkled in the distance, but they couldn't drown out the gnawing feeling deep inside her. She had done what she set out to do, exposed the truth, brought down Victor Moretti, and tried to give closure to those who needed it. And yet, the victory felt hollow. The case had changed her, had exposed the dark underbelly of the world she worked in. As much as she had tried to ignore it, there was one thing that lingered: Adam's confession. His truth. It was a weight she hadn't anticipated. What did it mean for her own sense of justice, when the line between right and wrong was so blurry? She had spent her career chasing truth, but now, in the quiet solitude of the evening, she realized that some truths were never fully complete. They left behind remnants, unanswered questions, lingering doubts, and faces that never truly faded from memory. Adam sat in the small park, watching children run past, their laughter carrying on the breeze. He wasn't sure how long he had been there, but the world felt both too large and too small for him. His prison sentence had begun, but in this moment of stillness, he found himself reflecting on everything that had brought him here. The moment of confession, the consequences, and the pain he had caused. There was no erasing the past, no undoing the damage. But as he looked at the children playing, a small, unfamiliar feeling stirred inside him. Hope. Not for himself, but for the world he had taken for granted. Maybe redemption wasn't about making everything right, but about learning to live with the mistakes and trying to be better, even in the smallest ways. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but today he allowed himself to feel a fleeting sense of peace, however fragile it might be. Maria sat in the small apartment she now called home. The walls were bare, save for a few framed photographs of her family. The echoes of her past felt distant now, almost like a different life. Adam's betrayal had shattered something deep within her, but time had allowed her to heal. Slowly. The memories of their happier days still lingered, but they no longer haunted her. She had let go, not of the love she once had for him, but of the life she thought they would share. As she prepared for another day, she couldn't help but think about the future, one that she would build alone. There was no place for Adam in it, not anymore. Yet, as she closed the door behind her, the faintest trace of something unspoken remained in her heart, a soft ache that time would eventually dissolve. For now Maria had chosen herself. Victor sat in a sterile room, his hands clasped in front of him, his mind calculating his next move. His fall from grace had been swift, but he wasn't one to remain passive for long. He was a man who always had a plan, always had an escape route. The truth about his manipulations had been exposed, but there were still avenues he could exploit. The world had a way of forgiving, of turning the page when the next scandal came along. He would rebuild. He had to. The question was no longer whether he would regain his power. It was about how he would do it. The dark web he had woven could be spun again, if only he waited for the right moment. His cold, calculating eyes narrowed as he began to plan his future, knowing that no defeat was final as long as he had the will to fight back. But in that moment, it wasn't the external world that haunted him. It was the recognition that the truth about him was out there forever. And that truth was something he could never escape. Diane stood in front of the window of her office, looking out at the city that had become both a battleground and a sanctuary. The case had come to an end, but something about it still lingered in her thoughts. The faces of Adam, Maria, and Victor, the lies, the confessions, and the painful truths. They haunted her, each in their own way. The city beneath her seemed oblivious, moving on as if nothing had changed. But Diane knew better. In the silence of her office, she realized that justice was not a destination. It was a journey, one that never truly ended. There would always be more secrets, more cases, and more people lost in the labyrinth of truth and lies. But that was her job, to seek the truth, to bring it into the light, no matter the cost. And as she closed her eyes, she whispered to herself, "Justice is never final. It is just the beginning."